Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? This is number 9 in the weapons series. We're going to answer some of the harder questions, I think, at least, in terms of what my take on things are. I warned you in the beginning that I'm not going to have all the definitive answers or say, yes, this is how I do things or whatever, because there's a lot of options. But I'm at least going to give you an idea of like where I'm coming from. I mentioned I like the game to be simple if possible. And just give you, some ideas on my take and stuff, and maybe you'll have some different ones. But there's a lot of neat options to choose from, just based on like all the various game systems I went over. In terms of multiple attacks and how you handle that sort of thing, I think that should be a fighter thing. I really don't think that other classes should ever have the opportunity for multiple attacks per round. I tend to use a somewhat longer round of first edition, although I've kind of pared it down to being about 20 seconds and just said the segments are 2 seconds long. But I understand the idea of the 10-second combat round too, or the 6-second combat round or whatever. But I think that despite the things that Pathfinder's done with stuff like that, I like the idea that you just give fighters multiple attacks and maybe they get them the way they do in 1E. Maybe at at 7th and 13th level they get some extra attacks. In terms of two-weapon fighting, that can be a really tough one. I really kind of like the idea of the good old -4, -2 penalties in first edition. But it's obvious that when you have a high dexterity, especially, and you can kind of cancel out some of that stuff, that somebody even like a thief that's using two-weapon fighting gets multiple attacks, and their chance to do more damage per round is pretty high. But at the same time, I don't see a big problem with that, because to me that's kind of the character differentiation and customization thing. You got this guy with high dexterity. His shtick is he likes to go out and use two weapons, and of course your armor class suffers. And if you're a thief, what are you doing in the middle of combat anyway? For the most part, you should really be kind of hanging back and waiting for the time to do a real telling blow or something like that. But if you're a fighter that has this great dexterity, maybe that can be your shtick. You're using two weapons, and that's kind of neat. In terms of now the specialization, how do you handle that? What do you do to make specialization work in your game? There's all kinds of things you can do. I talked before when I was talking about the fighter that I've just been letting them choose a weapon every once in a while and getting a +1 to hit with that, and then every few levels doing +1 damage with all weapons. And that's something I've been playtesting. But just looking at over these things again, there's all kinds of different things you can do with that as well. I like the weapon mastery idea from Rules Cyclopedia quite a bit, that there's various levels of specialization. I like the idea that characters should start out in something like Basic or Pathfinder, where they're just proficient in all the weapons that they are allowed to use or that are on their list, so to speak. But the idea that maybe not at first level, because I think that's kind of too fast, but the idea that at X number of levels the various classes get a chance to maybe specialize in a weapon or a fighting style or something like that. And then, obviously the fighters progress to, the fastest in that. And then maybe there should be a cap, so maybe the magic user can only get just a little bit better with a weapon. But somebody like a fighter could get really good, and then somebody like a cleric or a thief could, fall somewhere in the middle. I also like a lot the idea that Pathfinder uses for those weapons groups, where the person chooses a group, and then the next time he chooses a group, he gets better at the old group by 1. But instead of doing that by groups, I like the idea of maybe choosing your specialized weapon. So maybe you decide you want to use the mace the first time as the weapon you want to get a little better in, and then the second time you go ahead and you choose, like, say, the sword or the bow. But because the mace has been your go-to weapon, you're actually still getting better at it, and so you don't need to feed a bunch of slots into a system. You can just let the guy continue to get better at that original weapon he chose, and then go on with that. In terms of what should that affect? I like the idea of it affecting damage before anything else, because the to hit always gives you a much better advantage than damage does. But the idea that eventually it should affect your to hit bonuses, at least in a modest way, is cool. The idea that it should affect your armor class in a modest, positive way is also cool. And I can see with some weapons like daggers, maybe that doesn't make as much sense. But for the most part, letting somebody go through some kind of levels of mastery where eventually their armor class gets better by 1, 2, or 3, is cool. I don't see the need to make it, versus, X number of people, because then it gets complex. If you want to do that, that's fine. But, just the idea that you let something like that happen is really cool. And then in terms of where weapon mastery has primary and secondary opponents, yeah, it's realistic. I don't want my game to get that complex, so I'd rather have somebody just get better at a weapon, and then be able to get the better damage, the better to hit, and the better armor class, no matter who they're going against, for the most part. And also in terms of special weapons effects, I have a couple thoughts on this. First of all, I like the idea that certain weapons are going to be better at doing things like disarming or tripping, or holding people at bay, because that makes sense. Obviously a flail or a sword is going to be better at disarming people than something like a club. It just makes sense. And ditto for something like long pole arm is going to be really good at tripping somebody. Now, there's a few ways you can handle this. I talked about my opposed roll, mechanic that I kind of stole from Pathfinder and modified, and I based off their CMD thing, but I call it the opposed combat mechanic or whatever. The idea that you take your attack bonus, your 20 minus your THAC0, and you take your strength bonus and your dexterity bonus, you add all those up, you make opposed D20 rolls, and so you're trying to trip the guy. You rolled higher, you win, you trip the guy. I like a system like that, and maybe you're using a weapon that maybe gives you a +2 to trip because it's just a good weapon to trip somebody with. Maybe that's the only weapon you can trip somebody with, and maybe if you're specialized in that weapon, maybe you get a little extra, kicker to trip or disarm or do that stuff. I don't see the need for it to get really complex though, in terms of special effects. In terms of how you handle all the various vagaries of a system like that. Also, anything else I could wrap up in all this thing would just really be. Oh yeah, fighting styles. The fighting styles are kind of interesting in 2nd edition. I don't see the need to really get specialized and things like that for the most part, except maybe the 2-weapon fighting style. That's kind of cool. I like the idea that maybe if somebody spends some kind of slots on that, eventually they could use 2 bigger weapons or something like that, or maybe get some kind of I don't see the need for them to get maybe less of a penalty for using 2 weapons, because that's already pretty powerful as is if you're using the standard 1st edition, -4, -2, or -2, -4, minus your dexterity. But the idea that maybe you get so good at that you can use like 2 big weapons, that's kind of neat. But I don't see the need to get specialized in the 2-handed style, or the weapon and shield style. If somebody wants to use their shield to bash somebody, let them use it to bash somebody. Now, in terms of actual weird mechanics that you would find in something like D20 or Pathfinder, that would be feats. To me, I think there's a few ways you can handle this and never get into feats. The first thing is, as a class, progresses in levels, or perhaps as somebody becomes more specialized with a weapon, they should probably just get those kind of things. There's a whole bunch of bow feats in something like Pathfinder, but I think if somebody specializes in the bow, maybe over time, especially if you're using that motif where they don't have to spend more slots on it, they just get higher in level, maybe they should be able to do all those really nifty things that you could do with a bow, rather than having to take like this whole feat tree or something. And in terms of some of the other specialized attacks, like things like whirlwind attack or cleave, I don't know. At some point, my suspension of disbelief just kind of wavers a little bit. And if somebody wants to make this big, gigantic whirlwind attack, sure, go ahead. It's -5 towards everybody. Or, I'll give you, a 10% chance of really being able to hit all these people. Or figure out something that makes sense. But of course, if they become, say, specialized in the longsword, maybe that gives them some kind of edge to do some kind of thing like that. But I think sometimes people, there was a thread on RPG Net where they're talking about that, and I think sometimes people put the cart before the horse, and what they're asking, when they're asking like a 1st edition DM, how would you handle this? Is they say, I want to have this nifty mechanical effect. Would you let me do this? Whereas I think sometimes the mentality you need to have, especially in the older game, is I want to do this. What would happen? And I think that's a better way to look at it, because I think sometimes people have been too programmed into thinking of just like this, nifty feat mechanical effect, thing they want, as opposed to, I want to try this action, let's see how neat it is. And I think, to me, that makes the game a lot more fun. And, it kind of goes with the original vibe of the game, that you can do anything, you can try to do anything.